All right. Welcome everyone to the latest installment in our Warm Meet the Funds webinar series. My name is Sam. Today I'm joined by Miranda and Chris, who are the fund managers of one of our favorite investment opportunities on the Swarm platform, which is FarmCoin. We love having investment opportunities that have a really well-defined social impact. And that has always been one of the goals of a swarm, other than democratizing finance through all different types of investment opportunities. One of the ones that we sort of handpicked to have on the platform as our earliest funds has been this one, and one of the most exciting opportunities, the first of the ones that we have in Africa, and with a really well-defined mission to help a lot of people and solving real problems. As a brief introduction, Food Asset Coin Ecosystem, abbreviated to FACES, is a joint venture that aims to provide infrastructure and resources to all the unbanked farmers in Africa, of which there are 700 million. And this enables them to, through their agricultural efforts, feed their families, feed their own communities and countries, and in turn the world. We'll be going through a presentation of how the FarmCoin infrastructure and ecosystem works, how the farm token acts in the ecosystem and the role that it provides in the investment opportunity. And then we'll open up to questions from the community. Feel free to post questions on the Facebook stream. And I'd like to hand over to Hiranda at the moment. Welcome, Hiranda. Nice to have you here, and tell us a little bit about FarmCoin, and when you're ready, we'd love to see the presentation.
Sure, absolutely, Sam. I mean, FarmCoin's a joint venture between a UK-listed company called Block Commodities, of which Chris is chairman, and FinCom a financial and commodities ecosystem company that I'm part of, that's been involved in Africa from our perspective in terms of developing exchanges and infrastructure for some time, and obviously working closely with Chris's company that's been involved very much on the input side, and between us we've been involved in the input financing side collectively. So what we decided to do a couple of years back was we saw the opportunity here where we had a live project and a successful pilot in Malawi with the Agricultural Commodity Exchange for Africa, ACE. And we realized that actually there was an opportunity here to provide services, whether it's provision of better inputs, because there's a lot of fake inputs across Africa, but also provision of better finance, but also provision of infrastructure to farmers and that whole agricultural value chain. And when we went to the traditional banks for finance, we found that finance was lacking for infrastructure development and also then on the other hand for farmer financing. But on the other hand, we found that where it was available, it was at really extortionate interest rates, even if there was security offered for those loans. And this created a cycle where farming communities didn't really have the developmental capital. The development finance institutions, of which we're engaged with a number, were also slightly more conservative, but doing things in pockets rather than cohesively making a real impact. Because as you say, if we want to benefit 700 million farmers, we've got to do it in a way that scales and then becomes exponential. Hence, Chris and I got together and we combined our expertise from both sides, us from the market side and Chris from the supply side, and then created bases, as you mentioned, and also then looked at the whole token economy around it and created FarmCoin. And Chris, would you like to add to that before we kind of walk through what FarmCoin is?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Miranda. I think our real objective that we were trying to achieve and now bringing into fruition was the ability to actually disintermediate interest rates in particular. So pushing out interest rates to farmers in the normal fiat spaces, they're moving it around. In Zambia, they're around about 40%. In Uganda, they're around about 22%. So the ability we have by working with our tokenized group that we've done, which is I think probably one of the first tokenized communities where we bring different tokens together to actually create solutions, we're able to now push out a much more reasonable 10% interest rate for loans for farmers, smallholder farmers, and asking them to pay at the end of their term of harvest. Usually they pay during the period of harvest, during the period of farming rather, so they pay monthly. So if they haven't got money, then they can't pay the interest rate, and therefore they're risking the farm. And the ability that blockchain and the ability that tokens have given us is the ability to actually plow through that period of harvest and get to a period when they're actually receiving an income via FinComico solutions, to actually be able to pay back the interest rate that allows them to buy the fertilizer, that allows them to grow the produce, be it coffee, grain, rice, whatever.
So, sorry, Miranda, just before you jump into that, because I think we'd love to sort of hear more detail. I guess essentially, if we were to sort of hopefully not too simplistically describe the mechanics of how it works. Essentially, what the joint venture does is make loans to farmers to enable them to undertake their agricultural activities. Those loans are provided at much cheaper rates than they would otherwise get in the open market, and the conditions to repay those loans are very much more favorable to the farmers than they would be otherwise. And then blockchain technology comes in to sort of take the trust issue out of the equation, allowing all the participants to have more information, knowledge, and trust in terms of the transactions being assured, giving more guarantees to the farmers, to the suppliers, and the eventual purchases of the produce. Is that sort of have I described that well enough in simple terms?
Yeah, I mean that's one. That's one aspect, because really what we've created with FarmCoin is something game changing. Because again, if we look at my background, it was very much from the capital market side as well. And so when we've looked at this, but also a technological background, very hybrid. When we've looked at this, out there, there's a lot of hype. Where even when we look at certain tokens and so forth. But we really understood what the underlying use cases on some of those pinch points are. And what we've created is a multifaceted token here. So yes, absolutely, what you've described is certainly one use case that's addressed by the token. And there's certainly then, when we, as Chris mentioned, when farmers get better inputs, they get cheaper finance, their productivity will go up, and therefore they'll have surplus income at the end of the day. And when you link that to the consumer side and the utility of use of that token, certainly there's opportunity for them. I mean, one, banks, but two, now they've access to a much wider range of products and services. And they've got the purchasing power for that as well. And so all of a sudden, we've got input providers now that can accept FarmCoin to provide inputs. They know that that their inputs are then being utilized in the right fashion, and it's all traceable and it can be tracked by the blockchain. But in turn, now linking that with other initiatives we're involved in on the consumer side that we've announced as part of the initiative, also then creates wider utility. But then the second aspect of FarmCoin is, beyond being a utility token, is also being an infrastructure investment token, because loans are only one aspect of that whole agri value chain. And if we look at agri-tech as a whole, where we've then got, now on the back of what we've done in Malawi, we're getting a lot of data, and we'll walk through the slides, but with what we described on the loan side, and providing better transparency and access to information, better access to markets, and reducing what I call bad middlemen, farmers' incomes in 2016 with the successful pilot that we did with 47,000 smallholder farmers, they went up 31%. Now, can you imagine what impact that has for national GDP? If we now that 47,000 farmers would have been over 500,000 farmers if only we had better access to finance, which wasn't available from banks. As we embarked upon that, we also realized that actually there's improvements needed to a greater or lesser extent in warehousing, whether that's localized collection points or whether that's large agricultural warehouses. But also there's an opportunity here to make the warehouses the hub for the community. Why not have Wi-Fi there, education, banking services, other consumer services, as well as being able to deposit your grain and look at kind of more traditional forms of finance, as well as new forms of finance where we can lend crypto assets more cheaply and still and loan them and provide much cheaper loans to the farmers. But beyond that now, FarmCoin, working closely with you guys at Swarm, what we're also doing, as you know, is then earmarking the investment into the infrastructure. And we'll go through which aspects of the infrastructure we're talking about here, because there's a number of different elements that all come together cohesively then to build that ecosystem.
Right. Awesome. Perhaps now would be a good time to sort of talk through some of that how that infrastructure investment works, and
Sure.
if you want to.
Yeah, I'll share what I'll do.
With us.
So just and so if we look at that, I mean, we've already spoken about kind of the joint venture, and as we said, FarmCoin in itself, it's an asset-backed infrastructure investment coin, and as Chris mentioned, it's developing the whole agricultural ecosystem. So if we look at the primary aim, it is financial inclusion, as you mentioned, Sam, with social impact, but it's for profit, but sustainable profit. So we're very much, for our investment community and those investors in the Swarm community coming into FarmCoin, certainly, this isn't a charitable enterprise. We're working closely with development organizations to also look after that aspect with capacity building, because yes, that is important. But certainly we're looking at sustainable profit here, but we're looking at this in a scalable manner that then propagates out and benefits everyone, including those farmers, including us as investors, and it's incredibly rewarding as well. And so we've already spoken about farmer financing, and that's two aspects. That's loans for, as you mentioned, in relation to then buying inputs and then applying those in terms of farming and production. But on the other hand, also, bringing your crops, surplus crops, into a warehouse now, being able to, the blockchain align what's happening in the digital world with physical, because, we've done a lot of work here. People talk about, yes, the blockchain being immutable, but actually, you've got a physical commodity you're speaking about in a warehouse here. How do you reconcile that digital world with the physical world? And we've done a lot of work there in terms of, is the crop stored correctly? Is it graded correctly? Has it been weighed correctly by the operator? What inventory and controls are in place so that if we're creating financing instruments on the back of it, is there trust in the underlying warehouse and in the underlying commodity that's in that warehouse as well, that we're creating the digital asset from? So that's one point. And then if we look at this now, the way that investors will participate in this token, because it is backed by real assets, and because it does afford them the ability to take fractional ownership and benefit in some of the upside of that token, because it's much more than a utility token. The gains are then markedly more measurable and more substantial than just a single utility token. Now, what does that mean? Why is FarmCoin an asset-backed infrastructure token? We hear a lot about asset-backed tokens out there, because what we're talking about is not just loans, but we're talking about seeding the development of the wider deep farming networks. And when we're talking about this, ultimately, as you said, Sam, it's in a simplistic form. Okay, you've got agricultural production, whether it's smallholder farmers, medium-sized farmers, larger commercial farmers on the one hand, but ultimately we've got to link that to the global consumer. Now, the global consumer is becoming very savvy because, you and I in the past, we didn't care about carbon footprint. We didn't care about where our food was coming from. Now, all of a sudden, you see these initiatives where you've got artisan coffee shops. It could be in Manhattan, they could be elsewhere, even the home of coffee, Seattle. And consumers are much more worried about where their meat is coming from, where their coffee is coming from, what it is that they're eating. Is it genuinely GM free and so forth? So a lot of the technology we've developed allows us the ability to track that from source supply all the way through to the ecosystem to the end consumer. And then what we have in the middle is obviously farmers produce something, but a lot of the time in Africa, you see these grains rotting and large silos there. But now we're providing them access, whether it's development of logistics and infrastructure and agricultural marketplaces, given what FinCom Eco is doing already, to be able to link that into the silos and then in turn link that to the large exporters who are buying that agricultural produce. And in turn, then that's then accessible to the international market, but it's traceable all the way through from the start. Now, when we look at that, in the heart of that as well, what does better access to markets mean? We're developing better agricultural finance, but also agricultural commodity exchanges, which we've already successfully done. So, the important point here, Sam, is we've already proven this model in Malawi. Mm-hmm. Recent announcements with FinCom Eco in Zimbabwe, in Ghana, in Mozambique. So this isn't something that we've dreamt up sitting in an office here on a webinar. This is real. There's a lot of practical feedback going on with the work that Chris is doing on the input side with fertilizer, pesticide, seeds, and the work that we're doing developing agricultural markets, and also financial instruments so that people can hedge risk more effectively. Now, what does that mean? It's a travesty that that a lot of these prices for these commodities aren't set where they're produced in Africa, in certain countries. Those prices are being set by speculators in Chicago, in derivatives exchanges there. They're being set by speculators in London. Right. And these prices don't really, in the most part, work in favor of those local producers and aren't really in their own interest, because the whole idea for hedging the whole idea for derivatives exchanges was hedging, but 95% of that is speculation, where the price is moving. So what we're doing is by creating decentralized exchanges, creating buying and selling on exchange, creating better price transparency for farmers, we're also creating better price control and better index benchmarks locally, which allows us in those countries and in Africa as a whole to take on and have better control of those prices and the development of that ecosystem. Mm-hmm. With all of that, there's a lot of work that we've done looking at, what does this mean? We need Wi-Fi connectivity across Africa. The system that we develop works online and offline, but equally, when we talk about propagation of education, smartphone development, payments is prevalent across Africa, but, how do we encourage wider internet access? So, we're also working with some of the telco providers. Physical infrastructure in the ground takes time. If we look at fiber going from Cape Town up the west coast to Abidjan and Accra, but also the satellite technology that we're leveraging. And so wireless communication of data, weather data, education becomes prevalent. And we're already profiling farmer data now in Malawi, which also allows then other services to come in. So we're partnering with insurance firms, other financial services firms, but now because they've got access to better data, they can price those services more effectively and price that risk more effectively back to those farmers. And I'll let Chris speak about other aspects, on this side when we talk about, we spoke about smart warehousing, but where we talk about the input side and soil analysis and data. So Chris, over to you on some aspects of that with what kind of FarmCoin underpins.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there, Randa. I think the key elements of what we're trying to achieve here, and has never been achieved before. And as you said, we sell fertilizer on a daily basis. the structures that you have together so far as commodity exchanges and the work that's been done out in Malawi. That's what we do on a day-to-day basis, and to be able to bring those together for the benefit of the smallholder farmer, so that actually we've created an exceptional solution. I think that's really what the nub of what we're trying to achieve is. So going back to the points you've said, in terms of creating a total ecosystem that creates a smart network between the farmer, the data, the input and the output, it is now achievable. It's achievable through blockchain, it's achievable through AI, it's achievable through nanotechnology, it's achievable through drones. And those things that we now have available to us, combined with the fact that we're now going to make it accessible and easy for the farmer to actually get finance so he can actually produce goods that are going to change his life, creates a very, very unique solution. And that's essentially what FarmCoin is. And, you know, in terms of where we're going with it, I don't think anyone's been there quite there before, but it's where you'd imagine an American farmer with all the technology and all the finance that he has to bear would try to achieve. But people forget that in Africa, we leapfrog technology. So our technology goes not in, you know, from chip and pin as happened in America to suddenly a swipe card. It goes all the way to mobile money. It goes bypasses banking. It goes to mobile money. It goes from to things like M-Pesa and MTN money. And in this solution here, you've got a solution in which you've got farming 3.0, and it's all in one package that we're creating right now with the assistance of FarmCoin.
And Chris, just let me jump in here because we have a question from David, who's joined on the webinar, and he asked, can you give any numbers? Chris says we sell fertilizer every day. Is this through VIPA or VIPA? Is that? Yeah,
so Viper, the company that we've now invested in South Africa, has been in business now for a number of years. And it used to be actually the front end of Cargill's fertilizer business in South Africa before Cargill pulled out of Africa. They sell generally into blenders, and we're now bringing them into the rest of Africa, into sub-Saharan Africa, and they're going to be providing us, they'll essentially be the engine for us when we take the technology that we're describing now into Uganda, Zimbabwe, into Zambia, and into South Africa again.
Great, and we have some more questions. We'll get to the question session a little bit later once we've gone through the deck. I just felt that one was relevant to what you just mentioned. So feel free to continue.
Sure. Yeah. You know, when we look at, and I won't go through every slide here, we will share these with the community, as you know, Sam. But you know, in terms of stats as well, you know, if we look at this, you know, there's some interesting numbers here because you know the key here is, you know, if a lot of time the raw materials are going out and there's no value add in Africa, and actually the value is made elsewhere, you know, because if we're paying $2.50 for a cup of coffee, you know, the end farmer might be getting 8 cents, right? And it's the same across the value chain. Now, you know, what this will encourage is value add, as Chris mentioned, because, you know, you can go fundamentally first into packaging, and then, you know, if a large percentage of tomatoes gets destroyed on the road because infrastructure is so bad in Nigeria, and they're importing $100 million of tomato puree, that's a travesty, right? Mm-hmm. So what we're now seeing is an encouragement of localized value-added production closer to source, both to satisfy local demand, but also then create more international exports. Now, what does that mean? I mean, ultimately, it means that you know, green balance of payments is going to improve because, you know, the bulk of African countries are running on a deficit. So really, if we get this right, then we're not only talking about kind of feeding the world and Africa being the breadbasket for that, but we're also talking about those countries moving into budget surplus. national GDP going up, but then on the per capita level, there's a fundamental impact as we go up that developmental chain as well. So that's the ultimate aim, and we'll talk about how that's playing out. Because again, like I mentioned, we've got some real use cases that we've successfully tested here in the context of Malawi, and if we look, again, we've already spoken about the model. I won't go too much on these slides, but the community have them available in terms of how the farmer links to the local exchange and how that on a Pan-African level and more internationally linked, and also how the solution works cross-border, because of course now with blockchain and decentralization, if you have one commodity and I have another, and now we've created a pricing matrix, there's no reason why you can't exchange that commodity that you have a surplus in with a commodity that I have a surplus in. You don't necessarily need fiat money for that. And certainly there's a lot of work that we put in to facilitate that construct. I mean, I did a TEDx talk recently where I talk about we're almost going back to the age of barter, but it's a new age of barter.
Right.
And bridging kind of the current world economy with the digital economy, because the two, to make a real impact, the two have to interconnect. And certainly a lot of the initiatives that we're working on certainly lend themselves to that, and FarmCoin being the key one. So when we speak about that, again, we spoke about how it works, and see, as you go through these materials, there's a lot of detail here. I mean, not only cutting out the middlemen, but also, what the scenario was before with the farmer, the local exchange, with financing and with cross-border trade, and what the scenario is after with the introduction of FarmCoin. And a lot of this here is underpinned by real analysis and data that's led to this matrix up here. And we've covered most of this at a high level in the discussion that we've had. And then, we've already spoken about kind of the exchange, hedging instruments, and then being able to finance those assets, whether it's financing the tokens or in a more traditional sense, financing electronic warehouse receipts, but also then bringing in other producers. Because great, I'm not saying we don't need the banking system here. We're talking about alternative means of finance. But equally, now if the banks are competing to lend, but they also have more transparency around the users. They have more transparency around the behavior of those users, of course, with data protection and everything else taken into account. It will mean that ultimately the banks are competing to lend, which ultimately means the cost of borrowing, even in a more traditional sense, should fall, just because we're now using technology and blockchain in a more transparent manner and opening that up and allowing them to compete. And ultimately, the end farmer will win. And equally, people talk about, well, if we're going to offer farmers better prices for their crops, isn't the price for the end consumer going to go up? No, actually, what you'll get is more consistent quality. You're going to cut out those making money from an inefficient ecosystem that aren't adding any value. And so actually, the end price for the consumer is going to be consistent, but a better level of quality and a better level of supply. And so, that's one fallacy that we want to kind of just put to bed here. And then when we talk about now what we did with the Agricultural Commodity Exchange for Africa, ACE was trading as a well-established exchange since 2006. We got into this originally. We were just going to provide them with technology where we were trying to link the whole ecosystem in the manner that I've described and allow them to have the exchange in the middle and warehouse receipts financing. And then we realized actually there's a much bigger opportunity here, which has led to where we are with FarmCoin today. And so over the last 2.5, 3 years where we've been working with ACE, obviously what we've ended up doing is, the stat that I mentioned, we've had tangible impact here where, even with a very focused pilot, those income increases have been real. And now, from the perspective of Zimbabwe, we've worked very closely with government. We've announced an MAU there, and certainly, as we've announced publicly, that's with the joint venture unit, and will translate, as Chris also stated, into a fully fledged project and an agreement that's imminent and that's no secret with what's out in the public domain. But they've really estimated that that this is going to lead to a substantial amount of job creation. When we're talking hundreds of thousands of jobs, just under 700,000 jobs, and it's going to lead to an increase in terms of GDP, an impact over the next 3 years of about $1.5 billion US across the economy, and job creation that's both indirect and direct. And so, what we're talking about is tangible impact here at a macro level that then really transcends at a micro level back to the smallholder farmer, as Chris says. Again, with technology and what we're doing with the tokens and with FarmCoin at the heart of that, underpinned by blockchain. We speak a little bit about the different technologies here. They're all real. This isn't something that we're going to bring the investment in and we're going to then develop the technology. As I say, it's already running in Malawi. It's now being deployed in Zimbabwe. It's been deployed in the context of Uganda and Kenya, as Chris spoke about. And what we've done is, as you know, Sam, this space is fast moving. There's new technologies, there's new initiatives coming out on the blockchain all the time. But because we're very tech savvy and we're financially very savvy, we've managed to identify early stage a number of years ago, a number of interesting technologies, whether it's a SCADA on the mobile banking side. Because think of this, in Malawi, we created this fully electronic ecosystem at the heart of it, but the banks that we were working with were still manual and they didn't have the money to the infrastructure. So we then identified that there was white label technology out there that we could provide them that allowed them to have visibility into the ecosystem without the investment, and that we could have a revenue share model on that allowed them to then service what we were doing in an electronic sense on the exchange side. Codel, where linking into what we're doing, is a private blockchain provider. We've done a lot of work there to create high-speed transactions, which then link into a public blockchain, which addresses some of the issues of time to write to blocks, which allows us to process transactions much faster and in higher volume. And then with GMX technologies, what we're doing with the whole exchange software side of things. So all this is already integrated, and we're adding new technologies all the time, with some of those that Chris has mentioned, which we'll be announcing as we move forward, so that the ecosystem then is growing out and expanding, leveraging kind of, I call it 1 + 1 makes 11. And we can do a lot more with, which is what tokenomics is about, right? It's all about what you have and what I have combining. And then, your token, my token, creating greater value for the end investor ultimately in delivering return. And that's kind of what I'll dwell upon. I mean, the management team is well established. We have the ex-UK Minister for Africa and the Commonwealth, the Right Honourable Mark Simmons, on board, and he's certainly involved in FinComico and Block Commodities as well, and very much part of the FarmCoin venture that Chris and I and the team have created together. And then we also have, beyond myself and Chris, Steve Round, who has done a lot of work he was chairman of the Big Issue up until recently. He did a lot of work banking the homeless that didn't have, that could get access to finance even though they didn't have addresses. Now, this is important for Africa because a lot of these farmers don't have traditional addresses and postcodes that you're familiar with. So how do we get finance to them as well? And we've been doing a lot of work around that, but also then the fact is, Steve's done a lot of work around financial inclusion and social impact that we're able to then really learn lessons from and now deploy in an African context as well. So that's important. And then, we have Rory O'Brien, who's our project director. Rory has deep experience of commodities, agricultural value chains and exchanges, and is heavily involved now in terms of that whole, how do we map the digital world to the physical world, and a lot of the work that we've done there as well. And then, from the investment side, we've also got Houghton Street Capital, who have helped us put together a really extensive business model and financial model for this that can show investors that we've got a real return on investment here as well, beyond everything that we're doing. I mean, ultimately, what does it mean for value of FarmCoin, which is important? And there's a huge amount of experience combined with what Chris and his team bring across the value chain here. So we're not talking about guys that don't have experience here, we've lived it, we've breathed it, and we've brought it together. And hence, this is why FarmCoin is in front of you.
Great. And I want to go back to a point that you made earlier, which actually ties into the experience and the pilot program that you ran. And it goes back to why we handpicked FarmCoin to be one of the first opportunities on the Swarm platform. We're talking about an opportunity that is proven with an existing, a proven income stream. We're not talking about something that is, purely on paper or hypothetical. And this is more of this is an investment opportunity that provides your pilot program with the ability to scale, to virtually a continental program in wider Africa. And I think that's really important to remind, some of the investors on the Swarm platform, is that all the opportunities that we're looking at the moment have income streams, have proven returns, and that specifically with FarmCoin, you're able to not only participate in an investment which has a track record, but do well at the same time. And do good at the same time, which is an incredible combination. I wanted to see if we could maybe learn a bit more about the use case for the token itself in the block ecosystem. Perhaps run through sort of a practical example of, and I know that this is covered on the platform in a little bit of detail, but perhaps you could talk us through how does the token play a role in the mechanics of the program, and how does that translate into the value of the token?
Sure. And Chris, do you want to start with that, and then I can add anything that I may wish to?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of our usage of tokenization, I think the key element to look at here is, one is the huge distribution we can bring to bear to tokenization. I think a lot of issues around utility coins and the utilization of coins, which are two separate things, have really been around about how many people are actually going to get to use this coin. In our market is one of unbanked farmers, of which there must be somewhere around in excess of 300, 400 million people involved in those communities, perhaps as much as 700 million. And we've got to look at how this is going to open up for their lives. But in just getting down to the detail of it, essentially what it is that in our system, traditionally using fertilizer in some of the countries in Africa, particularly Zambia, we've always used an e-voucher system. An e-voucher system is a digital payment system. So what happens is that the farmer gets given a digital voucher. Sometimes people think that maybe people won't be aware of how digital stuff works in Africa, but that's primarily how the majority of transactions are communicated are now through mobile phone. So they take a digital e-voucher, they take the e-voucher to the warehouse where the fertilizer and the inputs are stored. They hand over the e-voucher traditionally, and then they get back fertilizer after swiping their card, and then they take it once the harvest has grown, some months later, be it grain, be it coffee, be it tea. They take it down to warehouse where they get another e-payment system involved in their lives, which is a warehouse receipt system, which is also a digital payment system. What we've done is replace those with digital currency. Digital currency allows us to collect data, allows us to actually expand beyond that, it allows us to disintermediate interest rates, it allows us to also create a flexibility in the way that we communicate with the farmer communicates with us. So what we do is we loan them the digital currency. The currency is taken to the warehouse. They're given the inputs, and later on they are also can have the choice of being paid back their digital currency or otherwise. But because it's a closed loop system, in which we control the cost of the fertilizer, but also involve ourselves in the purchase of the produce, something that micro lenders do not do. And these micro lenders are often much lauded, and I think one of them won a Nobel Peace Prize. Our situation is very different. What we're doing is providing a service in which the farmer will not go bankrupt because we will pick up his goods at the end of the day, in which he's required to actually pay back. And in terms of how the digital currency will work, in that it will replace the e-voucher, it will replace the warehouse receipt system as well. So in that way, it actually streamlines the whole service, allows them to use their primary means of communication and transaction, the mobile phone.
And then, just looking at that at macro level, because, again, I've got a slide up here with the different countries FinComico is engaged with, and we spoke about the Zimbabwe example. But because, as we mentioned, beyond that, FarmCoin's an asset-backed infrastructure kind of investment coin as well. All the improvements that we're making at country level. I mean, we speak about in this day and age, there's been municipal kind of bond ICOs and other things that have been kind of announced recently. But here, really, we're talking about then at a macro level, a country level digital economy here, because everything that we're doing that underpins that then, as Chris said, whether it's the data, whether it's infrastructure that we're assigning that capital to, all of a sudden now, there's always been questions about, well, funds come in country into an African country, are they being utilized in the right manner? Are they going to the right places? Are they the right investments? What's the return on those investments? With the blockchain, everything becomes measurable. So, we can now bring in the capital that we're raising, deploy it effectively, digitally, in the manner that Chris has mentioned, and also for a whole manner of those other use cases that we addressed earlier on in this presentation. One, it's transparent. Investors know that it's being used in the right way. Two, the return is inherently measurable, which also then comes back into the value of the token as well. And that's really, really, really important. And as we then expand that, there's a network effect, a multiplier effect to the power of N, because we do it in one country. Zimbabwe's 1.5 billion net impact on GDP. Obviously, the digital token, what's happening there in the real world in the manner that I described. Now, we're across 21 countries and more, because there's problems inherent across all sub-Saharan African countries, not just 21. Just look at the magnifier effect of that and the value on the FarmCoin token, and therefore the return on investment. So what we're talking about here is, as you rightly say, Sam, in terms of the pilot proof of concept, what we've done, we de-risk the execution now. Now it's all about scaling this, expanding the network of partners and technologies that we can bring in, and the business construct on the other end of that, and that should lead to sustainable and really good returns, and as you said at the right time, create social good as well.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there as well. Thank you, Randa. I think the other point that needs to be mentioned is, we're putting the smallholder farmer back at the center of the ecosystem. Often he's marginalized, the smallholder farmer, in terms of, and I think this has to be looked at as not just a fantastic value investment, it's also an impact investment. We're looking at a farmer who's now suddenly he has access to data. He becomes part of the data source. He has access to smart pallets, smart drones, smart soil. Making sure that there's a precision farming actually occurs, where we actually know what kind of fertilizer is absolutely required in the way that it is, to the soil that it is, and that is relayed back to us, and we're able to actually supply that to the warehouse. All of that's a communication process. It's very hard to do in Africa, where nearly all the costs are those of logistics, and suddenly that whole supply chain has been shortened, and also the cost of that supply chain has been shortened as well, because you've got smart contracts. You've got permissionless, trustless scenarios now, allowing the farmer and the financier to get together without, as Randa said earlier, the bad middlemen getting involved in it, which have been, to date, a huge part of the cost. And I'll give you just an example. If you're in Uganda, you pay twice as much for fertilizer than if you're in the Ukraine. And that's crazy.
Yeah.
When you think about the risk of doing business in the Ukraine, which is in a virtual civil war, and we're talking about countries like Malawi, Uganda, Zambia, they have not been at war for over 30 years. And in Malawi's case, never. So it's just bringing the reality of people being able to trust each other, or not even trust each other, actually just do business with each other without the necessity of proving anything, apart from the fact that they can do business with each other. So, all of a sudden, we're able to grow our produce on the ground, and we're actually be able to find market without the usual difficulties that occur in Africa, just disintermediating the corruption and disintermediating the inefficiency.
One of the things I think I'm most excited about in sort of Swarm and your joint venture coming together is, and I hope this happens, is that the ability for these individual farmers not only to participate in the program, but actually to buy into the investment opportunity themselves. I mean, one of the things that Swarm is doing is, democratizing the access to investments that were previously only available to the very wealthy. And so now not only is this program going to benefit these farmers directly by allowing them, putting them, as you say, central in the role, in a more central role in this ecosystem, but now they'll be able to take their profits and revenues and actually invest in themselves by, potentially buying into FarmCoin themselves, which create this sort of beautiful circle of opportunity. So I think that's a really exciting thing that sort of is a wonderful synergy from our two ventures.
Absolutely, Sam, and and it can't be reiterated enough that if you have to pay interest rates on a monthly basis before you've actually grown your harvest, you are risking your farm. Therefore, the chances are you're not going to take that loan at all, especially when that loan is at 40%. So that means that if that person can never send his kids to school, that person can never actually build his house bigger, grow more land, grow more produce on more land, take on more land, cannot invest, cannot participate in things like cryptocurrency, cannot participate in any other forms of actually growing his wealth. He's stuck in a subsistence lifestyle. So we're talking about, an opportunity probably for the first time in centuries to actually break that cycle.
Right.
And that's why, this is worth supporting.
Great. We've got a few questions here that we should try and get to in the time remaining. David posted a question regarding a previous slide which said plus Vietnam and Ukraine in the bottom. And he just asked to explain, if you could, the references to those two countries in that previous slide.
Yeah, sure. So when we started out this initiative, it's very much focused on Africa and here, but equally we've had development organizations and also governments and local bodies in other jurisdictions approach us who who also see this as not just an issue to address in the manner that we've done it in Africa, but also a range of other emerging markets. So, one of the development organizations, not to be named at the moment, but one of the large ones said, look, you saw this and we need this in Southeast Asia. We also need it in Latin America as well. The Ukrainian opportunity is slightly different because it's much larger. It's of a much larger commercial nature, but equally there's an impact there because recently Egypt, up until recently, Egypt was importing wheat, and because of lack of transparency around that and lack of storage, by large value, huge amounts went missing as it was imported in from Ukraine, and Ukraine's become a large commodities powerhouse as well. And so, but if we look at this So if we look at FarmCoin, and again, this is positive from the perspective of investment. Yes, very much we're focused, and this is why we've made such rapid progress today, and it's underpinned by work that we'd already done individually before the joint venture came together. But beyond that, it really scales, which ultimately means that it can expand more widely beyond Africa, which ultimately then means the value of FarmCoin will also go up, which ultimately means the return for investors will be greater and the social impact will be broader.
Right. I mean, that's as the network increases and as the network participants increase, that'll obviously lead to a higher demand for the coin and an increase in value. And that actually goes to another question which we had from Zazu, which was, is FarmCoin coming to South America? And clearly, as you just explained, it can scale, and the skills and lessons that you're learning from not only your pilot program, but as this rolls out more widely, could obviously be applied to global, more globally.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We have another question here, which is, can you give us more detail on how these community hubs in the warehouses are going to work, and if FarmCoin will have a role in these?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, just taking Zimbabwe as an example, because there's been 20 years of underinvestment in that country because it's been cut off to foreign capital inflows. If you compare it, from the perspective of what it's doing in an agricultural sense, it's a similar size to Côte d'Ivoire, we've noticed, in terms of essentially warehouses it should really have. But if we look at grain silos, it's got 32 there compared to something like 236 in Côte d'Ivoire, which means there's massive underinvestment. And we're talking about warehouses of various degrees because, as I mentioned earlier, they can be smaller local collection points because this is all about linking the network, logistics, supply, to much larger agricultural silos, which are kind of more well positioned for the ports and outbound export, for example. So when we look at all of that, then certainly some of these warehouses we see they're very simple huts, lack of security and other things, but really there's no real hub for the community here. They'll come there, they'll do what they need to do, deposit the grain, and then they'll go away. But we noticed very early on that there was a real opportunity here because the community are using them and there's in and outflow there. Now, whether it's creating a localized marketplace linked in, as we described in the slides, to a more centralized national one and then an international one on the one hand, but equally then to provide other services, because of course people will need banking services. Of course people want education. They want, and part of this is education because if we're talking about, as Chris mentioned, we're market side, we're trying to guarantee working with organizations, by buyers agreeing to buy farming produce in advance, what the farmer will produce in next year's harvest. But if you try telling them what a futures contract is, you'll scare them. So we really need to educate them, and education's important. And how do you do that at grassroots level? Again, in many ways, I've been a little bit disappointed with the lack of support we have had from the development organizations, because there's a lot of rhetoric out there. But then, when you go to them and you do capacity building or you ask for finance in some respects, the talk's there, but the action is lacking. And but in some ways, it's great because when your back's to the wall, it forces you to come up with innovative models like this with you guys at Swarm and join forces and address this. And ultimately, that will open up the development finance institutions and others in terms of finance. So when we're looking at this broader opportunity in the warehouses, some of this investment comes in to create those community-based hubs because we can, and because they're localized, and because then it's a link back into the community, and we're doing this because as we know that we've got the cooperatives there that already aggregate kind of farmers, aggregate produce to a certain extent. We're linked into many of those in country, and once we do that, we can galvanize those warehouses. And look at it this way, Sam, because at the moment the warehouses perform a very commoditized function. They store your commodity. As they start to now use the land mass to develop these services, we can also, those warehouses themselves become investable, because all of a sudden you can bring in finance to improve those warehouses and bring in these services because of the revenue stream attributed to them, alongside not-for-profit education and other services, and it becomes self-sustaining. So absolutely, this is essential to the plan, and we're very much involved in that already. And we're going to be scaling that as we move forward in country and cross-border as well.
Yeah, I think the points that Hiranda made there are excellent. If you think about it, the warehouse becomes the place where communities collect, and they collect in two clear ways. One where they pick up the fertilizer, and the other way when they drop off their harvest. But along the way, because it becomes a hub, as you've described it, it's a centralized point where people can gather. So they can gather for education, so education can be provided. They can gather for health resource, so health resources can be provided. They can also be there in terms of the collection of consumer goods. It's very interesting to note across what we describe as the developed world, how the places where consumer goods were sold are now closing down. So shopping malls are emptying out. But what won't close is the place where the goods are collected, or or where they're delivered. So that's what's going to happen in terms of leapfrogging technologies in Africa. You may never see shopping malls, but you may well see these centres where communities aggregate, being the places where consumer goods are dropped off.
And also the adoption, Sam, for the token, when we talk about all these
aggregate.
Yeah. But encourages wider use and utility for the token with all those different actors in that ecosystem. So as an example, Sam, when Chris talks about healthcare, if we look at the prevalence of fake pharmaceutical products across Africa, is quite wide. And also, much like fertilizer, the prices of medicines vary and the origins are suspects. Now, when you then link what we're doing to that, and ultimately better healthcare, and we've certainly been approached by a number of pharmaceutical companies and companies in that space to try and align to what we're doing, which just shows you how the ecosystem can then expand out, and ultimately how the token can then have more value as well.
That's really interesting. I did some development work back in a previous lifetime in Afghanistan, and I actually with the elections based, and I could see the use of these sort of community centers being used for those type of purposes as well. Gathering people to participate in elections, for example. If there is an element of security and I can see a lot of interesting uses for these hubs. So that's fascinating. And I think you touched on another question here, which was how would FarmCoin integrate with agricultural cooperatives? Because in some parts of the world, that's the only way for farmers to survive, is to sort of become a part of a cooperative. And would FarmCoin allow farmers to be a little more independent of that if they so chose to?
Yeah, absolutely. And here we're saying, if you still want to use a middleman because you don't have transport to go to a warehouse, now you can do it, but you might get cents on the dollar as opposed to 10 that you got before. It's your choice. If you want to use a cooperative, it's now your choice. If you don't want to use a cooperative, it's now your choice. So this is what democratization
really means.
And ultimately, the choice is back on the end farmer. So much like ours today, we can do what we choose, and we who we want, and we can supply who we want. That hasn't been the case, as Chris also mentioned, with these farmers caught in this kind of low income trap. Yeah. Now first time in their history, they genuinely have that choice.
it's really empowering these marginalized communities, which is definitely one of the most exciting aspects of blockchain technology and projects such as yours. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. There's one here. Will there be a farm coin for each type of commodity? And if not, how will the underlying value of the token be calculated if it is backed by multiple commodity types?
Yeah, so actually, we're looking at FarmCoin in terms of its entirety as a single token. That's not to say, and it's a very, very interesting question. It's not to say that you can't have fungible variants of that. And in fact, this was something that I was talking about just before we got on this webinar. So it's quite a topical question. But as I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, we created this matrix where any asset can be priced with any other asset, which also then allows you, a bit like an index, might consist of a range of constituents that underpin it. Think of the FarmCoin token by value consisting of a range of constituents below it that underpin it, but although some of those parts and the individual aspects of those are all well understood. Now, what does that really mean? Yes, absolutely. Even if we look at wheat or white maize or other commodities, they aren't necessarily fungible from one country or another, because the way, even though we're doing a lot of work on standards and contract specifications, but the way that they're graded, the way that the contracts are specified, the way that they're delivered can be markedly different. And so, but the key here is, in country, when we go in at grassroots level and we define the standards, there's a level of consistency because we're doing that across the board with some local variations, because we've got to take into account regulations and government policy and other aspects as well. But equally, we also know the variations of those because we know at detail the quality specifications, the contract specifications, and so forth. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also pricing those by virtue of benchmark rating and also the fact that we've got live trading in terms of buying and selling via the FinCom platforms. So that in itself then leads to what underpins the FarmCoin token being easily calculated and transparent as well. Now, whether we then create, let's say, a variant, as we go forward, we may well, we've been approached by certain countries that said, well, actually, I want a FarmCoin for my country. And not just an overall FarmCoin. In some respects, that's an interesting one, and I could see it playing out in a fungible fashion, because ultimately it will feed into the value of the overall FarmCoin token, because certain countries have a weak currency, or if we look in the case of Zimbabwe, it has no currency at all because it's reliant on the US dollar.
Yeah.
Now, of course, central banks are worried about losing control and complete democratization. But if they leverage the digital economy in the right way, it can harness all the benefits to the population that we've spoken about, but it also can create a new form of currency for them that's linked back into the official economy, as I mentioned earlier. So certainly, I do see this playing out as we move forward. There are some discussions that we're already having, and it's a fast developing space, so watch this space.
Great. And I guess just to round it off, one thing I like to cover, just to make sure that we sort of give a rounded, a more complete picture of any investment opportunity. What would you say are the risks associated with investing in FarmCoin?
And Chris, do you want to speak about this, and then I'll add to it? I think he's dropped. So, I mean, as with any investment, and it's no different with blue chip FTSE 100 companies. Any given time over a period, the value of your investment can go up or down, and there can be a variation in that. And so, investment risks are always there. Of course, as we mentioned, there's a lot of work that's been done to de-risk that and make sure there's real substance here, because I've seen this market. I'm heavily involved in the blockchain space, advisor to a number of other initiatives as well. And we saw a number of over the years where 2 men and a dog and a website could lead you to be funded. Now investors, I mean, not just institutional investors, but even private investors are increasingly more savvy. Now, that's one thing. So they're questioning the real substance behind that, of which we can demonstrate with FarmCoin. The other thing important is diversification, because if you're putting all your eggs in one basket, then inherently there's more investment risk there. Now, if we look at what we're doing with FarmCoin, and we've just addressed this with the previous question, we're diversifying not only across a number of different countries, but also in terms of the use cases and the utility and the wider uses for that FarmCoin token and what underpins it. So whilst investment risks are always there for any investment, what we're doing is creating a diversified portfolio that underpins that token, which should also help de-risk the investment and make it more attractive as well.
Mm. There's a question here from David, which is probably more for myself and the Swarm team, which is, for new investors in digital currencies, can you provide a simple one slide of how to invest in FarmCoin? And he says, I know that some prospective investors are put off by lack of understanding. And David, we're well aware that some of the concepts here of investing, via crypto into real world assets is very new, and we're constantly working on getting the messaging right and the process right. It's something that I'm personally involved in on a day-to-day basis, and so we are in the midst of updating, our how-to sort of section of the Swarm Fund platform to make it easier, because fundamentally a platform and a blockchain such as Swarm can't scale until we have the everyday investor being able to understand what they're getting into and how it works. So I appreciate that it is difficult to understand, and it's something that we're very conscious of. So I think we have one more last question here, which I think I partly know the answer to, Hiranda, and that's, have you thought about getting financial support from cryptocurrency projects, other projects that have raised a decent amount of money and a culture that promotes your type of program? And I think you are partnering with some other crypto players to provide slightly different services than what Swarm is doing. And if you want to talk about that for a minute, and then we can...
Yeah, sure. So, again, I spent a lot of time, we've seen a lot of evolution in our space, Sam, as you know, over the last few years. And really, about 12 months ago, I was kind of sat there thinking, well, where are we really headed with all of this? What does it mean? Because there's a lot of fly-by-night stuff happening in this marketplace, but where are we really going? We speak about digital economy and we speak about tokenomics. And as I said, the way that this will propagate and the way that this will get traction quickly in expanded form and create the most benefit is if, much like we're partnering, Sam, Swarm, with Swarm, and together, your value add combines with our value add to the benefit of what you're doing, we're doing, and our investors are doing, and everyone involved in that ecosystem, whether it's the farmers on the one hand and consumers on the other. And of course, you have to play to your strengths, because you have strengths, we have strengths, and then there are gaps in that ecosystem to create a complete virtuous cycle. So that the value, and even whether it's tokens or secular, and have the most use, that's where you need to bring in other players into the ecosystem and combine that so that 1 + 1 makes 11.
Right.
And I call it a network effect, a multiplier effect, if you may. Now, therefore, in that regard, there have been some recent announcements where, for example, if we look at on the consumer side into merchants, and to some extent on the lending side, Dala and Wala in Uganda and beyond have brought on a lot of users, have made that link to mobile money and the networks that we've spoken about. So linking into that helps us accelerate what we're doing and propagate it to a wider range of users more quickly, and also allows us to have utility of their tokens, and us to have, and for them to have utility of our tokens and to be able to distribute them and have use over a wider network. Similarly, another announcement we've made is with OST Simple Token, and that's more linked to the consumer side of things. as well, because as Chris mentioned, you know, walls and other things aren't prevalent in Africa, and it's all about now leveraging technology and creating a wider range of uses for those goods and services, links back into the value of the token. So we made a couple of recent announcements. There are also some interesting announcements to come, both at country level involving governments, but also other bodies that are involved in the agricultural ecosystem. And certainly, you know, during the course of this next 60 days, there'll be a range of announcements and a range of other blogs that introduce other partners as we go along on this exciting journey.
Great. Well, thanks very much for your time. This was incredibly informative. I have to be honest and say I'm really excited about, you know, following this opportunity and participating in it myself. And I'd like to invite any you know Swarm community and the wider community to consider this opportunity. You can invest in it via the Swarm platform. Feel free to engage with Hiranda and Chris and Steve via our community forums. We'll be posting the slides that we went through on the platform into the opportunity. And one thing we encourage is, you know, for potential investors to have access to directly contact, you know, the syndicate or fund managers, which is something that, you know, none of us as investors have really felt like that was possible before. And, you know, that's something that's really important to provide to the community. And we've, you know, that's something we're constantly thinking about how we can improve. So thanks again. Maybe in a few weeks we can do a follow-up, which I think would be great, and learn some more about what you guys are doing. And Chris, if you're, I think you might have dropped off, but if you're out there, thank you as well. And I'll leave you to last words, Miranda, if you like, and then we'll end it there.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Bye.